Alright, we are ready to begin our next lesson, and with this lesson, students will be able to create and use a line graph to display and analyze data. So let's talk about that. We have some new terminology. The first thing we're going to do is define what is a line graph. A line graph is simply a graph that uses line segments to show how the data changes. Line graphs are often used in order to show changes over time. And so we'll talk about that a little bit when we do our example. We're going to label the axes with the values that the points are going to represent on our line graph. And when we do that, we're going to call that our scale. You'll remember when we did our coordinate grid, we had a scale and it went from 0 to 10. On our line graphs, we may have data that's larger than 10, and so we may need to have a scale that goes up higher than 10, but we may not be able to fit it on our paper. So we're going to have to come up with a way in order to represent that data, and in order to do that, we're going to use a scale. And the third term you need to know is an interval, and an interval is simply the space between two values on the scale. We may skip count by 2s, we may skip count by 5s. That tells you what the interval is. So the important thing about intervals is that the intervals should be equal for a line graph, and so we're not going to skip numbers. If we skip count by 2s, we're going to use all the even numbers to create our scale, and we're not going to skip any. Even though we may not have any data points that use those numbers. So we need to make sure that when we do our intervals, that the intervals stay equal for the entire line graph. So we're going to make a line graph. Here are the steps that we're going to use. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to find the range of the values for each of the axes. And that's going to help us know how big to make our graph. The second thing is we determine how big the graph needs to be. Are we going to use a whole page to make our graph? Are we going to use half a page? Are we going to use a quarter of the page? We determine how big we want our graph to be. Then we're going to number the lines on the axis. Okay? And we need to make sure that we remember to number the lines and not the spaces, because the lines are what are going to help us plot our points. Once we get our axes numbered, we are going to plot the points that are from the data table onto the graph. Then we connect the points, and then we make sure we include a title and a label for each of the axes so that we know what the values represent. So we're going to create a line graph, and we're going to use this data set. This is projected temperatures in Orlando, Florida on the day December 12th, 2013, and it goes from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. Alright, so the first thing I've done is I've gone ahead and copied down the data table, and that's just so that I don't have to keep switching back and forth between the PowerPoint slide and our work on the paper here. So we see that we have the time going from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. and then we have the temperatures that were projected for those times for December 12th. The first step that we're going to do is we're going to find out what is the range of each of these. And the way that we do that for the time, it's really simple, because we see that we have 8 different times. We go from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. So we're going to have 8 different times, and we're going to label that across the x-axis. For the temperatures, it's a little bit more difficult because we see they're not in order. They're mixed up. They're going up, they're going down. Okay, and so the way that we find the range when they're not in order is we're going to identify which one is the largest. In this case it's 70, and which one is the smallest. In this case it's 59, and we're going to subtract those numbers, and that's going to tell us the range. And in this case, our range is going to be 11. So the next step is we're going to try to figure out how big are we going to make it. I've gone ahead and drawn the two axes. One of the important things I want you to do is I want to make sure that you're using a ruler in order to keep your lines nice and straight. And when you label or when you draw your axes, you're going to draw your axes right here straight across the line. Okay, they're not going to go in between. They're going to go straight across the line, and this one's going straight up. So let's label the x-axis first. That's the easy one. We see that up here, our first time is going to be at 1 p.m. We're going to remember that we're going to number the lines. And so I'm going to put a little mark here, and that's going to represent 1 p.m. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip 2 spaces and make 2 p.m. and then skip 2 spaces again and do 3 p.m. Skip 2 spaces again, 4 p.m., 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 7 p.m., and 8 p.m. So that has labeled our x-axis. Now we need to label our y-axis. Now we don't go across the different rows here. What we're going to do is we're going to start with the smallest value, which is 59, and we're going to go up until we get to the highest value. So the lowest value, 59, we're going to start right here and write 59, and then 60, and then 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, and I put 71 there even though we don't need it. Alright, so notice that even though we don't have some of those values, like I don't see 64 in here, even though we don't have that value in here, we're still going to number a row there for 64, and that's part of that rule where we make sure that we have even spacing for our scale. So once we've labeled the axes, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to plot each of the points. So the first point, we're going to think of these on our data table as an ordered pair. So this ordered pair is 1 and 69. So we're going to look at 1 p.m., go up to 69, and plot a point. The next one is 2 and 70. So we'll put a point there. The next one is 3 and 69, so it comes back down. Next one is 4 and 68. Next one is 5 and 67. The next one is 6 and 65. And the next one is 7 and 62. And then the last one is 8 p.m. is at 59. So once we've plotted those points, then we're going to connect them. And again, in order to draw straight lines, I'm going to want you to use a ruler. So I'm going to line my ruler up for the first one. And so this is our line graph. And then the last thing we have to do is give it a title, and we have to identify that we have time on the bottom, and then we have temperature on the side. So for our title, we can just say temperatures in Orlando, Florida on December 12th, 2013. For our x-axis, that is time. And then I'm going to turn the paper sideways. And for our y-axis, this is temperature. And I'm going to show that it's in degrees Fahrenheit. All right. So we want to make sure that when we have a measurement, we want to show the units that we used in order to take that measurement. So here's our completed graph for our temperatures in Orlando, Florida on December 12th. Alright, so for your practice problem tonight, instead of going on Moodle, what you're going to do is you're going to create your own graph, and you're going to use the information on the data table that's on the slide right here. One point that I want you to note is it starts at 12 a.m., which is midnight. That's going to be the first point on the x-axis, and then the second point is going to be 1 a.m. So it'll start with 12 a.m. and then the next one will be 1 a.m. and it'll go all the way till you get to 7 a.m. Once you have completed your line graph with this data, go ahead and rate yourself on our scale and write that at the top of your notes next to the heading. And if you have any questions or difficulties, please bring those to class tomorrow, and I will answer them then. Have a great evening.